We constantly talk about how kings within India would fight each other and would never go rampage civilians or temples or break temples. Of course, there is this whole leftist narrative about breaking temples. We're going to challenge that in Sangam Talks.
We can fall, but we won't bend. That message was extremely important in making the enemy deal with you in certain way. Akbar had to, basically change his ways. He realized that this mode of conquest is not going to get him anywhere further. He will keep destroying people, destroying empires, but he can't build an empire. He had to get, by force, he learned civilized ways of living and civilized ways of political expansion. So he started building alliances. So yeah, that jihadi aspect is there. He took pride in calling himself a Ghazi. So that is there. But did Akbar learn his lessons and then turn civilized? Obviously, because there are 3 generations there since Babur to prove that their ways have become civilized over time. So Hindus, at their own cost of blood, had actually civilized their invader. And we are not attributing that credit to Hindus anywhere in history. Right? I mean, because we have not seen this history as India-centric. It's the invasion-centric history that has been written.
Namaste, everyone. My guest today is Shankara Bharadwaj Khandevali. He's been a speaker with us earlier, and after his talk, my conversations with him, which happen every now and then, I keep calling him on phone to try and talk about the civilization, Hindu issues, and so on and so forth. And all my conversations with him have been extremely profound. I really enjoy them, learn a lot. I'm not an avid reader, so I hardly read books. I learn by conversations, by listening to people. This is the long background of what I'm doing with Anand Prasad and now starting with Shankara as well. So today we are going to pick up the topic of Islam and Islamic invasions into India. There's a recent video that has come out on the Charvaka podcast with Abhijit Iyer, where it talks about why India could not repel Turkic invasions and why we lost to the Turks. I sent that to Shankar to build on to a conversation we were having, and he had a completely different opposing viewpoint. So that's where we will start off today. So Shankar, thank you for being here. Are you all settled?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I'll start with the first part of the conversation, and we'll come to Abhijit Iyer in just a bit. But uh, so with Anand Prasad, if you saw my conversation with him, I believe you did, there was one viewpoint that Islam or Islamic invaders into India have been no different than any other invader. They've basically been invaders, and like all invaders, you go on a rampage, you plunder, you loot, rape. All of that is part of invasions, and that there are shades of gray, which is nobody is black or white. There are shades of gray. I get that, but he was basically challenging this notion that as if the Turkic or Mughal, basically Afghans or whoever, all the Islamic invasions that came in were any worse than anybody else, perhaps including India. We constantly talk about how kings within India would fight each other and would never go rampage civilians or temples or break temples. Of course, there is this whole leftist narrative about breaking temples. We're going to challenge that in Sangam Talks. But so what's your view on it? And I'll come to the Mongols and some videos that I saw about them.
So there will be definitely similarities between the Mughal invasions and the other invasions we see elsewhere by the Mongols, because basically whatever came here, the Mughals are basically Turco-Mongols. So the Mongol military machinery, which has the military machine that is successful, in conquest in other regions, the same machine was put to use even when they came to China or India. So there is no surprise that there would be similarities in the military techniques. Military, not limited to tactics, but the view to war, view to how an enemy is treated and things like that. So you first try to intimidate, you try to win over, then you try to instill more fear, then you try to destroy. So these kinds of things you would see would be very similar. But the main difference we would observe is not in the military tactic. Obviously, the any invading force would have its own advantages built. If it sees itself as an invasion force, it would have certain traits. It would build mobility into itself. Its main, it would want to be mobile, go plunder, come back. It would want retreat mechanisms. It would also make sure it maximizes its gains through any trade or an invasion. But if we go back further in time, let us say the Hunas were there. Hunas invaded various regions. They usually say there are two types. One went westwards from Central Asia and one came eastwards. So we also had Huna invasions. Yashodharma, we say, has defeated Hunas. He has assimilated the Hunas into the Indian soil. But their tactic was also, or techniques were also similar, basically cavalry, archery, and things like that. So those things are not the main differentiating factors. But what we need to understand is Hunas went different places. They did not convert others into becoming Hunas, or they did not make those territories Huna. Similarly, Mongols, wherever they invaded, they established a Mongol empire. But there is no trace of Mongol religion or culture that they have established wherever they went. They tried to assimilate into wherever they went. They invaded China. They adopted Chinese practices. They did not create a Mongol religion in China, whereas Islam did. So that's where the main difference comes. Islam. So the pre-conversion, let us say the Mongols actually defeated a lot of Muslim territories, but eventually they also got converted, not by military laws, but because it is their tendency to get assimilated. Then once the conversion did happen, you would see a qualitatively very different outcome of their invasions. Wherever the Islamic Mongol machine went, they had converted others. So they came to India, they tried to establish their rule, they converted Indians. They have established an Islamic empire, not a Mongol empire or a Turkic empire. Whereas Mongols went to Hungary, also they established the Mongol empire.
So they weren't establishing a Turkic empire. That's probably because there were so many factions in them. I mean, what if the Janpadas from India, one of them had become an invading force and gone somewhere? They would have established, for example, Chandragupta Maurya. Okay, I mean, of course, I'm going way back in time. But if he had started going to different territories and started invading, he would have established a Mauryan empire, but not a Hindu empire. Of course, there was no sense of Hindu at that time. But Shivaji Maharaj did, for example. So he was saying we want to establish Hindvi Swaraj. So I'm being a devil's advocate here, okay? I am completely with you, but being a devil's advocate here and trying to make arguments on the contrary. So had imagined Shivaji won, he would have established Hindvi Swaraj in all of India, then gone to Attak, then taken over Afghanistan, gone to Central Asia to establish the same Hindvi Swaraj.
Correct.
Yes. So
that exactly is a response to the Islamic invasion. Had the things continued the way the pre-Islamic world continued, I mean, Islamic pre-Christian also, the things would have been very different. Then you would not require a Hindvi Swaraj.
Got it.
In fact, so our geographic territory was very clearly marked, right? I mean, Bharata is there forever. So, I mean, although you called it different names earlier, Ajanaba, and then it became Bharata later, but that territory as a geocultural entity has always remained in our psyche. There were political units that kept changing, but they were never in the name of one religion or anything.
But say the Cholas, right? The Cholas went to Philippines, and this
Right.
whole thing of that we were never an invading army, we've never gone outside invaded. I don't know. Maybe the Cholas treated Philippines and Singapore, formerly Srivijaya, and all of that region as an extension of India or as an extension of Bharatvarsha. I don't know how they saw it. Maybe you can shed light on it also.
Yeah, that we don't invade or did not invade is not obviously true. Not just southwards or the westwards. We went southwards or eastwards. We also went westwards. So the ancient empires had gone as far as Khorasan when our kings did Ashwamedha. It's not that they limited themselves to the Hindu court or that kind of region. They went much farther west. It's not that we did not want to expand further or anything. The political ambition and capability of the rulers, if that was there, they did expand.
Okay.
But it was purely political. The cultural part was non-traumatic in the sense that the people of those regions actually adopted our practices because they found these more advanced.
So, what evidence would we have of the fact that we weren't imposing the Cholas, Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh temples all over Laos and Cambodia? Isn't that can that not be taken as a fact of us imposing our culture on them rather than them easily adopting the culture?
That's what. So if there is an imposition, there has to be an evidence of imposition, which is basically a conflict at the civilian level or all that. Now, probably it is not a fair discussion without having enough evidence because we don't know what exactly happened in the remote past. But at the same time, we only know of military conflicts. We do not actually know of civilian atrocity to show that we did impose. And for that, is there any indirect evidence? Yes. Within India, we have not seen that kind of thing, where except for brief periods where the Astika-Nastika rivalries and later Vaishnava-Shaiva kind of rivalries came, we don't see actually civilian trauma or imposition of one way of life onto the people and things like that. So as an extension, if the same culture has gone elsewhere, it would behave the same.
So the key difference I'm seeing, and that's a powerful insight, is that there was no civilian rampaging. There was no mass murder, loot, plunder, none of that. There may have been invasions, but they were invasions of kings, of territories, and all of that. And perhaps the fact that there was no civilian resistance also, perhaps, right? There are no stories of that. In fact,
yeah, to this date, they actually, if you see the Ayodhya motif in different countries, they actually try to relate to this Ayodhya and they try to have harmonious relations and things like that. Today's political establishments may see that favorably or otherwise, but let us say Thailand or Indonesia, these people actually relate to these Indian land as their source of their culture. They don't actually see this as an imposing entity.
Yeah, but
they have not seen you as the.
But Shankar, that could be that argument could be true for Indian Muslims also. If you're in any Muslim groups on Facebook or anywhere else, or in any group conversations, you will find that they actually find their heroes in Babur and Aurangzeb and Ghori and Ghaznavi.
But that's precisely the point. An Indian Muslim would see an outsider as his idol. Somebody who has brought in, and everybody accepts Babur has imposed things on us.
Yeah.
No Indonesian says that we have imposed anything on them.
Yes. So actually,
and he doesn't disown his own territory or region, or he doesn't look down upon his own native culture as something inferior to what we have exported there.
Yeah.
So that split personality is not there in an Indonesian Hindu, whereas it is there in an Indian Muslim. Yeah, which makes him essentially disloyal to the native culture, because now he thinks something alien is superior. Now he has to impose that on his own land to improve or elevate his own land.
While an Indonesian Hindu can take pride in Bali and Indonesia and being Indonesian, and Hindu at the same time. And look at India perhaps favorably, but like a separate country as well, equally at the same time.
So politically, he has no, or even military sense, he would not actually be sold out. Tomorrow, if let us say India is to invade Indonesia, I don't think he would be sold out to Indian just because there is a cultural tie.
Okay.
So in that sense, I would say nationalism itself, the sense of nation or sense of motherland, is more akin to the pagan cultures than the Abrahamics. Abrahamism is inherently transnational.
So just going back to the Turco-Mongols, there was basically no one Turkic empire that was invading. It was basically Ghoris and Ghaznavis, and before that, Bin Qasims and all of them. They were taking Islam along with them. One could argue that Islam, taking Islam along with them, is possibly just a way to motivate their forces, as opposed to as opposed to be the driving force behind the invasions. You see the point? They wanted to invade for loot, plunder, wealth, expansion of their empire, and using Islam is a way to motivate their forces. For example, you could say that the current Turkey president, Erdogan, he actually just 3-4 months back, he was addressing his soldiers in a big hall, and he brought up some sort of a chant of "We are the soldiers of Allah, and we have never been defeated," and just to raise up their emotions and all of that. Is he sold to Islam, to spreading Islam, or is he sold to the idea of a supremacist idea of Turkey taking over while using Islam as a tool? And perhaps the Arabs were doing the same thing. Do you have thoughts on that?
That is fairly easy to make out, because if we hypothetically say that they are using Islam as a tool, and the master of the tool is the let us say the Turkic or Arab, they never say
their own empires.
Correct. So, but they have never said that empire is the. They have not called themselves that. They have called themselves the caliphate.
So when Ghori won and raided into India, what was he calling himself?
The empire that they were representing. That empire never called itself as a certain geopolitical empire. It always called itself the Islamic empire.
I mean, Lodhis called them the Lodhis, right? I mean, at least from Indian perspective, they're called the Lodhis, for example, the Afghans. So
we had invaded. That's the two sides of it. Medieval Indian political history.
Yes.
A very brief article where I try to bring this contrast. Yeah. So if we see at 700 AD itself, the Islamic empire has started expanding quite fast and in a big way. Mm-hmm. And by 700 itself, it is comparable, probably slightly bigger than what we had in India. Between 700 and 1000 AD, we had probably by nearly 1000, we lost Afghan region. But that was, after 300 years, the gains of the Islamists were limited to that region. Whereas elsewhere, they had lost much bigger territories. Persia had basically fallen on.
So by 700 AD, they were actually called the Caliphate here.
Exactly.
It's called the Arab Empire. Okay. So
Arab.
The Arabs.
So yeah, Arab or Turk, basically that concept of Caliphate was always there for them.
And the Caliphate was basically always Islamic in nature.
It was always Islamic. The Khanate was Mongol, but eventually that also, became, with the Turco-Mongol thing, it also became Islamic. And the graph below shows basically the number of invasions we had seen during different periods. This map I had taken from Manasa Tarangini blog, who has generated a lot of insights on this subject. So the sheer number of invasions we have seen, we have to, even if we make a superficial win-loss ratio, our kings would come out, our warriors would come out in flying colors in terms of how many victories they had seen compared to the losses. So in terms of the motivation they had in defending the land or the ways of life we had been practicing, that is unquestionable in terms of how heroic they were, even in terms of success, not just in terms of their commitment.
So Abhijit Iyer talks about that we were trying to ape them. We were basically trying to get horses when we didn't have them. I've heard this later also in the Vijayanagar Empire that they had to, and Abhijit Iyer brought this up as well, that they were trying to, there was something called the Dakhini horses. I've heard this earlier.
Right.
They were trying to basically,
that if we go back slightly, even in the Hun time and then later the Mongol times, subsequently the Islamic times, any invading forces would believe in investing in cavalry or mobile forces. So mobile forces have their advantages. Prospering civilizations which are not inherently invading by nature, they might be invading, but they're not invading by nature. Their investments would be different. And when the encounters happen, there would be advantages on both sides, disadvantages on both sides. If you are defending on your own land, you would be at loss. So there are lessons that our people learned over time. The first lesson is building fortifications. So our history was always of symmetric warfare, man fighting man in a pitched battle, and even weapons and things like that. So the moment this became asymmetric and raids could happen in the midnight, they could take civilians away, abduct people, or kill in the massacre in the midnights and things like that. Then we started building fortifications. That's why we see a lot more fortifications on the northwest to defend basically from this kind of invasion.
So similarly, that was our response to Islam, or a different way of warfare. We are actually told that we never understood the nature of Islam. That is why Prithviraj let, whatever the story is, truth or not truth, I'm not sure, 17 times he let him off in his Rajput honor or something like that. He's derided a lot.
He is derided probably because of his own hagiographers saying that he has done that way. we don't exactly know, as he said, how many times the invasions happened and how many he really repelled. But again, the question is this. You had this big caliphate on the west, and India was basically bearing the brunt of the entire Islamic machinery for several centuries. Did we even have the logistics to go on an offensive westwards?
As an entire nation, maybe yes.
I doubt. And as an entire nation, to mobilize that whole military towards one raid, again, it comes back to your logistics. Do you have such a mobile invasion force or not? It's not just about can kings come together, keeping aside their egos. Do you have that military machine suitable for such an invasion westwards? I doubt. Eastwards, southwards, it was probably relatively easier. We also did see expeditions. We had made invasions. So that's a different story. Westwards, we were actually at the border facing a very huge empire. So it's basically a question of how much you can resist it. Even if you can attack, how much can you damage it in a way that you don't completely lose yourself after that? So it's a very practical question at that point. It's not as if people did not think of these things. Lalitaditya actually went westwards. Vikramaditya also went westwards. Barbaric invasions were not new to us. We did keep facing those invasions over millennia, not just centuries. But the difference that Islam brought is what we'll need to understand. It basically was not just these raiding armies. It was not just a representative of one geopolitical entity. It was basically bringing with it an ideology that can unify several geopolitical units. transnational in its nature. That is why it got its strength. So the Mongols did unite, but at the same time, Mongols also had their, So if we have to compare ourselves to Mongols were essentially polytheists. Tengrin, their blue sky goddess, she was their goddess. Genghis himself was a polytheist. So he did not actually employ the methods to intimidate the civilians to convert or anything. So the gains he had were basically limited to political and military gains. That was why the empire was not permanent. No political empire is permanent. So empires rise and fall. Genghis empire also fell, the Mongol empire fell, and after that, today, the world does not actually have any Mongol imprint in their day-to-day life. Whereas wherever Islam has gone, it has actually tried to assimilate others. That is where the difference Islam is making to the world is coming into picture. So you can definitely not say that they were simply invaders. They were the invaders, being Islamic invaders, not being Islamic, is where all the difference lies.
Okay.
I mean, we need to separate the military, the political, the cultural, all these aspects. Yeah, the military techniques we would be seeing, as I said, invasion forces have their traits. There would be similarities, but that is only the military side of it. But definitely, the Mongol military machine was not the one using Islam. It was Islam using the military machine to conquer the world.
So coming back to this point now of uh, did we understand the nature of Islam? Did we understand, or was Prithviraj Chauhan constantly in the imagination that he was fighting a dharmic king, an Indian territorial ruler fighting for territory? You seem to suggest that we had an understanding of Islam.
Right. So yeah, I just started the point there in terms of fortifications, how we learned our lessons and started building it. Similarly, we had learned a lot of lessons about the nature of the enemy and also how to deal with that enemy. The another example we see is the Jauhar that happened. 3 Jauhars have happened in the Chittor that have since Babur came, that had actually driven a very strong lesson to the enemy. Basically, that we can fall but we won't bend. That message was extremely important in making the enemy deal with you in certain way. Akbar had to, basically change his ways. He realized that this mode of conquest is not going to get him anywhere further. He will keep destroying people, destroying empires, but he can't build an empire. He had to get, by force, he learned civilized ways of living and civilized ways of political expansion. So he started building alliances. He started dealing with his opponents or rivals in a, you call it deceit or friendly or whatever. He applied more civilized ways of dealing with people and dealing with his political and military opponents also.
So it wasn't out of some greatness or inherent greatness of Akbar. Like Irfan Habib, I heard him once say Akbar was what a terrific man he was, and all of that. And there are, of course, opposing views that he was as much a jihadi at the outset of his career, political career in India.
Right. So yeah, that jihadi aspect is there. He took pride in calling himself a Ghazi. So that is there. But did Akbar learn his lessons and then turn civilized? Obviously, because there are 3 generations there since Babur to prove that their ways have become civilized over time. So Hindus, at their own cost of blood, had actually civilized their invader. And we are not attributing that credit to Hindus anywhere in history. Right? I mean, because we have not seen this history as India-centric. It's the invasion-centric history that has been written. That is why we don't actually see how our people saw these things and how they have shaped their reactions and responses to the different situations. Again, Jawhar is one example, but we see across the land we have seen such sacrifices, right? I mean, people immolating or that. That's not limited to Rajasthan region. It has happened elsewhere also, but yeah, primarily the Kshatriyas have done that. And more importantly, it's not as if in the probably last several decades we have seen a more articulate intellectual statement of Islam. Let us say when Ram Swarup calls it holy terror, although the book is banned, that is a very accurate insight. But at the same time, this is not something lost on us. I mean, by the time of Prithviraj itself, we had seen several invasions. We have seen them abduct women and sell them as slaves, and all this is a known thing. It's not as if people did not know it. But we also know the response to it. When Vidyaranya Swami established that Vijayanagara Empire, it was not because he did not understand the nature of the enemy. He understood the nature of the enemy. He understood also the solution. The solution is based on, let us say, if the problem statement is terror, the enemy is basically using terror as an instrument. Your answer would be to count. How do you counter the terror? The only answer to terror or fear is looking fear eye to eye. The Hindu Kshatra has the only answer to it. So far, the world has not devised a better answer to it. And that is why we could actually repel the invasions. Although invasions did happen consistently across over centuries, non-stop invasions came, we did fight them. We never gave up. People died. People have seen loss of life, loss of honor, loss of property, everything. But they never gave in to that one thing called fear. Today we have given into fear. So are our ancestors better in understanding Islam, or are we better? We think we have understood it. We have not. We have neither understood the problem nor the solution. They have understood the solution. They have implemented and demonstrated the solution. So establishing a Hindu Kshatra empire is the one solution to Islamic terror. And that they have demonstrated. Shivaji has demonstrated. Vijayaranya has demonstrated. The Vijayanagara empire has demonstrated. And frankly, आज हमारा औकात क्या है? We can't even get equal rights in so-called Indian, democratic republic. How much have we actually understood the psychological nature of the problem to address it?
Why do you think we lost it? It was because of the British and coming together of Hindus, Muslims together, or is this a Gandhian problem? Was it deeper than that?
It is deeper than that. What happened with British was basically our political entity collapsed. And whatever came later is essentially a post-colonial political entity. It is not a native political entity. That is what the Hindutva is trying to rebuild in bits and pieces. But it's very far from where it has to really get. We have just made a beginning, I would say. 1 century of Hindutva movement could just get a government, but in terms of thought process and to get where we really need to be, there is a long way. Where all these psychological problems can be actually really articulated and we can posit a solution to those.
And Hindutva, you're saying, is basically a response to Islam. Otherwise, we would have no need for it.
No. Hindutva is a response to the collapse of native political entity.
Okay. So it's a civilian response, if you like.
The employed civilian means to rebuild that lost political entity. Because after the demilitarizing that the British has done, probably this was the alternative they thought would work for us.
Who thought? Hindutva is not anybody's movement, not the RSS. I was having I got into a conversation, not me personally, but we had the chance of having Rahul Roshan come and talk about his book on, he's written a book called Sanghi Who Never Went to a Shakha. He's basically saying all of us, when we talk in public forums, we get classified as a Sanghi. We have nothing to do with RSS. We probably don't even believe in its ideology, whatever it means. We are just I don't know, working out of emotion, working out of intuition, or whatever it is. I mean, people like you may be working out of intellectual understanding, but people like me are simply working out of an emotion. From early childhood days of this being my mother, and this, there is no difference between the land called the mother and the culture and the spiritual thought process, however diversified it might be, right? So for someone like me, it's an emotional response, what is classified as Hindutva, whatever. Yeah. So I was basically saying that, I mean, you said they imagine, who is they? It's basically all individuals, right? All of us spread all over the country.
Yeah, but again, if you see it as a mother, you need to also say that this is a collective organism having its own responses. You may not actually see one collective political leadership doing all that thing. It won't happen that way. But this collective organism has its own genius. It will generate those responses. It has generated Gorak at some time, Khalsa at some time. It will keep generating those responses. It's not created due to one thought leader. Yeah, thought leaders will come. Let us say when Hindutva is probably attributed to Savarkar and Hedgewar, there are a lot of people, even Swami Shraddhananda, the Arya Samaj, but it's not those individuals or we give, obviously, we are our great gratitude to them, but we see this as a response of this collective organism.
So Shivaji's Hindavi Swaraj to Guru Gobind Singh's Khalsa Panth, all of these, and the Vijayanagar Empire, possibly the Ahoms, not possibly, but certainly the Ahoms, all of them are basically a response, the collective response of this organism. I don't know what to call it. The idea of India, or the
That
idea
is how
of,
I would see. Because, okay, did anybody articulate that North was getting invaded, you need to generate knowledge from South? But it just happened. I mean, that collective organism has its ways of responding. Is there a collective genius? There is. But it won't be visible as a intellectual articulation. It goes much deeper than that.
and the Johars are also part of it.
Or part of it.
They are one response to it.
Yeah. Or manifold response that this collective organism has generated. Different types at different times based on the situation. So going eastwards, generating resources, then trying to bear the brunt on the west, on the northwest, and trying to resist. All this, if you see this is one big organism, you can see its responses in a more coherent way. Are they coherent? Obviously, they are coherent. I mean, it's that perspective. But yeah, I mean, is there actually one point I wanted to make at that time when you mentioned Shivaji? The Hindavi Swaraj was a specific response required at that time. Until then, probably whatever empires were called, we did not have the problem of othering or vertical split of the world into an insider and outsider. That is basically an Abrahamic thought process. We understand that they always have this believer, non-believer, and then even communism has that twofold worldview.
Did we understand that of Islam, that there is an othering? The reason I ask you this is because in one of our lectures of Smita Mukherjee, she actually talks about, I'd asked her a question about, read somewhere that Shivaji Maharaj was writing letters to Aurangzeb when he had established the Hindavi Swaraj, trying to reform him, that you are the emperor of India. He actually saw Aurangzeb as the emperor of India somehow. And this I was not able to reconcile, because for us, Shivaji Maharaj was, the big
Correct.
establisher of it.
That happens. I mean, just because you write, I mean, Savarkar wrote letters to British, all that happens. That is not an ideological statement or commitment.
Okay.
But the point that India had several empires, several traditions were there. Our religious ecosystem is different. No? We have an ecosystem where traditions have their full life cycle. They come, they expand, then they dissolve into the stream. New traditions keep coming. That is our ecosystem. Now, this ecosystem had no direct way of dealing with an entity like Islam because it never wanted to assimilate. It never wanted to be part of this. It basically wanted to destroy this and replace this with its own monotheistic idea. So that was the first time we had to, within our society, separate the insider and the outsider. Until then, the insider-outsider was a clear geographic also. There was no insider that was outsider. Once the invasion succeeded, and by 1700 or 1600, by that time, we have actually had a lot of change within our demographic change within our geography. So we had to make this distinction. That is the backdrop of Shivaji's articulation of Hindavi Swaraj. Otherwise, he could have just called it independent India or whatever, Mukta Bharat or whatever. But it's not that. It was actually Hindavi Swaraj because we had to ensure our kingdoms follow our ways of lives. And they are loyal to this civilization, this culture. So that was why you had these the Bundels or several homes. All these people actually identified themselves as the natives. They always saw the outsider as the outsider. But in a political sense, they obviously have to deal with the political opponent in a very different way. There, these ideological statements won't work. Right? I mean, that's a different dynamic. Military dynamics are different. Ideology dynamics are different. So we need to see all these in their respective places. And there, obviously, we don't see that Shivaji lacked clarity as much as Savarkar lacked clarity.
Sorry, say that again.
There, we don't see Shivaji lacked any clarity, just like Savarkar did not lack any clarity. He was sure what he was doing. But yeah, I mean, practically, you do a lot of negotiations and using a lot of statements. That doesn't make to me any contradiction. I mean, the statements he was using with Mirza Raje, Jai Singh, if I'm right, when he was negotiating, that was very different. He was saying Aurangzeb is outsider, why are you cooperating with him? When he talks to Aurangzeb, he says, obviously, yeah, you are a lot of this, you should be more benevolent, all these things.
And actually, if you see it in this light, he was actually trying, either he was being tactful and maybe shrewd, or actually he was making an honest attempt to maybe cause some reform in him. Just like perhaps Johars were a response, and like you said, Akbar reformed after seeing what was happening. So maybe Shivaji was attempting that, nothing else.
I don't know, because by then Aurangzeb's nature was known.
Okay.
So probably it was not as much of a reform. It was just a, bait. You just throw anything at your enemy. Because Aurangzeb was very clearly seen as an outsider. I mean, representative of an outsider ideology, not just as an invader. And later, if we see, in fact, Shahu makes a promise to Aurangzeb. So after that, we will see a lot of political reconciliations. A lot of people to this date keep debating whether Baji should have allowed the Delhi Sultanate to continue. He should have replaced it with the Maratha crown and all that. But yeah, I mean, that should be seen more in a political and military sense rather than a understanding of Islam. It's not because they didn't understand its nature. They understood its nature. That is why they wanted to eliminate such empires and get their de facto control over the land. So while the de jure was left with Delhi, the de facto control was all taken up by the Marathas.
But then, why would they not? Why would I don't know so much about Shivaji Maharaj, but I mean, at some point, I know that if I'm not wrong, Bajirao Peshwa, or was it Ahilyabai Holkar, that she had offered to tear down. Somebody had offered to tear down the the Gyanvapi Masjid and build the Kashi Vishwanath, rebuilt at the right spot. And then there is some conspiracy theory about the local Brahmin saying that we will be slaughtered, and so the Marathas did not. So the question I'm asking, just to reiterate, is that if we understood the nature of Islam and that we knew that a large part of our population was also converting, we don't know how much, maybe 10-20% or whatever. Why would we not attempt to reconvert right there and then by force? Weren't
Why
we
do you
seeing?
think it did not happen? It did happen. Marathas probably also had a ministry itself for reconversion. So it's not as if they did
Really?
not try. Yeah, I think so. And reconversions did happen. It's not that they did not happen. This that they were impure and we did not want to be converted. That's, I mean, if you see the Devala Smriti, its instructions are very clear. The amount of compassion there, the amount of attempt made. But yeah, there is no black and white. I mean, they never had enough control or time to reconvert the whole mass. And it is not going to happen overnight. From tomorrow, you are a Hindu. Basically, you need to. It's a very long process, right? I mean, within our society, there were a lot of changes. The Varna mechanism itself, the dynamic had collapsed or was on the collapse. So socially, there were a lot of changes. So it's not a very easy transformation while facing an invasion to get this kind of change. Forget the past when they were actually facing external invasions. Today, you don't have an invasion. In 70 years, how much could we do?
That argument is because, like you said, we have just not understood this.
No,
The
let us
nature
say the
of
Indian
Islam.
state did not do. Indian state did not do is fine. The state is a continuation of British mindset or whatever. But the movements also have not actually gone that way. We keep saying Gharvapasi, but Gharvapasi, how does Gharvapasi happen without empowering your traditions into the forefront? No conversion happens through a political process. Conversion happens if your traditions are going out and getting people. Whether Ramanuja did or Shankara did, it is basically because those people had that place in the society, they could do that kind of activity. And that
So
process has stopped during, not stopped actually, it has slowed down. The bhakti was a defense, obviously, but that kind of aggressive turn back or conversion had slowed down during the external invasions because this kind of representative of traditions were physically eliminated. Now there is no such threat. I mean, there is still such threat. We keep seeing sadhus getting murdered, but that is the area where we need to focus. And we need to empower them and they will do their job.
the other way around, I mean, sorry to say, I will say humbly, and I normally never criticize any seers or sages, but I had a chance to once take as I normally do, behave very naively sometimes, or in out of instinct. I actually had a chance to meet Puri Shankaracharya ji in Delhi once, and I had written a letter. This was during the time when I was part of the Hindu Charter team, um, on two things. That one, he should, requesting him, pleading to him that maybe he could give a framework, a structure of large scale Ghar Vapsi. And what if every little temple could actually say, okay, this is how we do Ghar Vapsi. For example, Arya Samaj has really simplified it. You go there and within 2 hours or 1 hour of Havan Yagya, they will say, you're done. You're a Hindu now. I don't know why every temple can't do it. There is a rejection of this whole idea. And I had gone with this humble submission, and shockingly, I heard that it was actually the other way around, that whatever is left of the Hindu society will collapse if you do Ghar Vapsi. That was his response. I was completely broken, dejected, depressed after that conversation.
Which is, as a matter of fact, which is true, because right now, as you stand, it's not about Ghar Vapasi. More than Ghar Vapasi, it is about the existing Hindu society. If you see the sheets or the koshas in the Hindu society, the innermost sheath has been completely corroded. It does not have the vitality required to maintain a dharmic lifestyle across all the sheaths. That is a matter of fact. Now these people are they don't have the wherewithal or the control or the reach of their word to serve their purpose. That is true. So we need to work. That's where again, the political view versus the insider view comes. If we need to look inside out from the innermost sheath, let us say Vedamata or the Dharma, Vaidika Dharma. From there, we'll have to see what are the sheets, different koshas in the society, what is the extent of practice alive in each of these. You may see temple going people, but that does not mean they are actually Hindu in their thought. So it's a complex problem. When the seers say it is complex, it is really complex. It's as we stand today, it is really an uphill task. We need to ensure sufficient core or the critical mass comes in the innermost sheath in a way that it can exercise control over the rest.
We'll talk about this innermost
Yeah.
sheath of what this is and all of that. I'd like to understand. Maybe a separate conversation. We'll pick this up
Sure.
as one of the topics.
But coming back to the role of the seers, we'll need to understand again in terms of sheets. There is a Mulamatha, there is an Utsavamatha. The Mulamatha or the whatever the Shankaramathas are there, their responsibility is not Hinduizing society. Their responsibility is preservation of what could be lost if they are not there. Vedamata will be collapsing if the Shankaramathas are not there. Vedamata should be practiced by the Grihastha. Today he is not practicing. So the only abode where that is still surviving is these what is in direct relation with these mathas. So if they give up their job, we will end up with a very superficial society which doesn't know what it is practicing. So I would definitely not say that they should be brought into this conversion activity. There should be outer sheets where more activist traditions should be encouraged.
So
They should be doing that.
You see Ramanandacharya, Kabir and Sant Kabir and Sant Ravidas's guru.
Or even Arya Samaj. So
as
let them do
the
that
outer
job.
sheath, as the outer sheath.
Definitely,
you see them
they are
as
not
the
innermost sheath. Yeah,
okay.
They would be second, third, whatever. I mean, we can analyze that later. But that's where that activism comes, and they should be doing that, and that needs to be really encouraged. They should be working hand in hand with the Hindutva movements. That's how I would see we can see any success. I mean, that's the other part. I mean, Hindutva also, a lot of people, the moment you talk to them, they say, yeah, these seers are not responsible. They don't understand this problem practically. They are not supposed to. That's not their job.
Thank you for that.
Because they are doing a more permanent work which would suffer. Once you lose the permanent principle, nothing else will remain. So they are doing a more thankless job. But we should leave them alone for that.
This is a good conclusion to the...
Yeah, did they understand the nature of this? I'm coming back to that one. Yeah, fear is one aspect we discussed. Similarly, establishing a Hindu empire, they saw is the solution. Because that empire, the king would be responsible for upholding dharma. So the way he looks at temples, he funds them, the ways of life he tries to protect. That once becomes the rule book for the king. Then rest of the problems are solved. In fact, if you see the harmony, religious harmony, there was no Hindu-Muslim conflict under Hindu empires. There was only a Hindu-Muslim conflict in either a secular empire or under an Islamic empire. So even in that purely data-driven sense, that is the solution for us going forward. Establish a dharmic empire, automatically religious harmony, everything will take care of itself. We don't have to address each of these problems, either Garvapsi or the caste problem, one by one. These always have that one common solution. That's how I would see that.
It's a separate conversation, Shankar, but maybe just very quickly, right? If we India, even though it is not a dharmic state, or a Hindu state, it is just by the sheer population, the values of I mean, the Indian state actually carries the values of Hindu civilization even now. That is why it is pluralistic in nature. It tries to masquerade as secular and all of this business, but basically it is a plural. It carries the plural values forward.
I would debate that.
Yeah. Okay.
Because Indian state is, according to my knowledge, an Abrahamic state. It believes in secularism, which is an Abrahamism.
Okay.
And the way it states what a religion is, what it assumes of a religion. It is basically about the propagation of religion and all. This is how Abraham is seen. We don't see religion in that way. So our native religious ethos or the amount of freedom you need to give for religious practices, that's not there anywhere in the Indian state's outlook. That is why it has been disadvantaging Hindus. So it's by rule wrong. It's not by intent, by rule, both ways it is wrong. Intent wise, we can debate because people at that time were confused, all these things. But anyway, psychoanalysis is not necessary. But the spirit and word of the law both are Abrahamic in nature, is what I mean. That's again, as you said, we'll need to discuss that probably as a Dharmarajya, how it would look like, how different it would be from what we currently have and all that.
Yeah, those are all conversations I want to do with you. We will end this one over here. Thank you very much. It's been very, very insightful. Brilliant. I hope to do this every weekend with you. Let's see how we can, keep weaving things together from where we leave off at. So thank you all the people. So we'll continue from there also. Thank you very much.